Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Baker, and I am here with my friend, Dr. Georgia Pavlik Rosenberry. And we are here to do a little bit of a presentation about some work that we've done with rural districts today. Now, let's talk a little bit about our objectives for today. We are going to talk to you, and it's more like a conversation that we're going to have with each other today. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the successes and barriers that were involved in our work with equity with our Southeastern Ohio districts that we worked with. We're also going to look at exploring different approaches that we use to engage rural districts in that exploration of different equity models. And then we want to share some additional resources, strategies, examples of ways that we can help rural districts think about becoming more equitable. So that's our three objectives that we'll be talking to you over the course of the next 45 minutes to an hour. So let's first start with a little background of where we come from. As I mentioned, I'm Lisa Baker, and I am the State Support Team Region 12 Director. The State Support Team for Region 12 is one of Ohio's 16 regional SSTs, and that's what we call ourselves for short. We are really working with other partners to support districts and schools in developing this unified system of education. We work to provide technical assistance to school districts. We work with educational service centers, community schools, early childhood centers, and we do that across 13 counties, so pretty large geographical area. Our main focus is really working with the Ohio Department of Education. We work with a multitude of offices there, including the Office of Exceptional Children, Early Learning and School Readiness, and other supports around literacy and behaviors. So we're working to help them help districts and other community programs succeed in the academic success of all children. And a little bit more about the uniqueness of kind of our region. I put a map there in the center, but we span up to northern Ohio and then all the way down to southern Ohio. So pretty huge region. So that does give us some opportunities to look to see how things are different based on some of the culture and things that's happening throughout that geographical area. And sitting within our region is the Jefferson County Board of Developmental Disabilities. And I'm going to let Georgia share a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So I came to the Jefferson County Board of Developmental Disabilities from SST 12. I was there for 3 years and did a lot of equity work with Lisa and other consultants. At the Board of Developmental Disabilities, we really focus on servicing a specific population, but always trying to get our folks equitable services and allowing time for education, not just in school districts, but also in the community about how people can be more equitable specifically to our population. So it's a unique turn to equity, but something that we take very seriously here. And we actually service 5 school districts. We have a program, and we also have a regional spectrum center that we house within our Board of DD. So it's a unique setting.
And the good news is I still get to work with Georgia, even in her new role. So that's exciting, and we're happy to still have that relationship together. So that's great.
Yes.
So let's talk about where our journey began with our rural districts around this topic of equity. So when I came into the SST, I actually came from the Ohio Department of Education. And so I was somewhat familiar with the region and having to living in the region too, what some of the things entailed in terms of culture. So we first saw some districts be involved in the integrated comprehensive systems of equity, which I'll go into more detail here in just a few minutes. And so they were exposed to that. From that model, we also talked a little bit more about another regional program that another region had tried around equity and tried to get some districts into that. We tried some book studies and all kinds of things as we were learning more about what was working and what wasn't working. But this is a very unique, as I said, region, because you do have some districts that are northern Ohio that are very used to those equity conversations. And so they might engage more and you can start talking about equity with them. But then as we move farther and farther south, we were seeing that trend of not wanting to engage too much around that term even of equity. So that led us to having to think of some different strategies. And I don't know, Georgia, if you want to expand a little bit more on this topic.
Yeah, I think there's a stark difference too between the populations and the districts that we serve at the SST. We have the majority of our districts are rural and small town districts. And then we have two who are considered urbans, but they're not big urbans. They're kind of smaller urbans. So it presents this dynamic where you're constantly trying to balance between different cultures. So especially for our rural districts, when you bring up the word equity, the only thing that they begin to think about is race, and not thinking that there are several other ways that we need to be equitable. And even if we don't have a very diverse population, we need to be thinking from different perspectives of different populations we have. And one of the things that even became apparent to us in our office were our own differences and what we each brought to the table in our backgrounds. So it was definitely taking us in a lot of different directions, but it was an exciting way to begin these conversations and begin thinking.
Yeah, definitely. So let's dive into that first, the first interaction that I actually had with some of the districts around this equity work. So as I mentioned, I came into this region actually first as a consultant and then eventually as a director. And my very first day of work was to attend a training with a district on the integrated comprehensive systems of equity. And this was a systems model that was very clearly defined, action steps, and lots of professional development and coaching. And on the next slide, I actually have linked the website where you can get more information as well. But this was the first strategy that was tried with our district. And this was another initiative that was happening in another region farther north in the state. And there was an invitation, hey, we have a little bit of extra money. We're bringing this speaker in anyway. You really need to grab some districts and come up and join us. And, of course, my director at the time said, sure, let's do it. Let's get them involved in this. This is really worthy work. This particular initiative actually was offered by the Ohio Department of Education to districts who wanted to try some innovative ways to improve academic success for all students. And so we had an opportunity to hear that introduction. And there it was very interesting, the reactions that we were getting from the district that we brought to that training. Very standoffish, probably not the right people at the table that the district brought. A lot of the district brought people that wanted to get the extra money. And so they were the ones that signed up. So, we had the union president of a district, we had a bus driver, we had a couple other people. We had one or two leadership team members from the district there as well. But needless to say, as they walked out at the end of that day, I didn't get the feeling that they were going to go back to their districts and really embrace some of the great discussions that was happening. So I want to be very cautious and say it wasn't about the training, and it wasn't about what was happening with the presenter or anything to that means. It was the message that they weren't quite ready to receive at that time. And so that was very, very interesting. And literally my first day on the job, and thinking, wow, we've got some work to do.
Yeah. Especially around this work, because ICS really thinks about that equity piece for students with disabilities and how are we including them. So, Fertura and Capper, who did this work and this is their research, they really thought this through, and they have a great system and way of approaching it. But our people didn't want to hear anything about it, especially because I think a lot of times in rural districts, and Lisa, I know you're going to explain what this is and go through the cornerstones, but in rural districts, our funding doesn't look the same as it looks in some of our urban districts or our suburban districts. So those resources that are available in other places aren't always available to us.
That's so true. And so as we're looking at any model for any district, one of the things that we think about even from implementation science is where's the fit, what other initiatives are happening. But I do want to share with all of you just a little bit of background, because this is a great system. And if we work on mindsets first, this totally could happen. It's just about meeting people where they're at. So the ICS program has 4 cornerstones. There's a focus on equity, aligning staff and students, transforming how we're teaching and how we're learning. And then we're also looking at leveraging funding and policy. So getting at that systems level to make true change be very sustainable. And as I said, you can go on icsequity.org. They have a lot of information on there about their key features of their system. But we continue to really appreciate the work around the system, and not saying that we're not using some of it, but just giving you an idea of some mistakes and things that I think we made along the way. So let's move on, and we'll talk a little bit more about our journey, moving on through our next road stop. So again, we decided again that we were going to bring ICS one more time. I was going to try one more time. So I was a new director. I remembered Elise being so engaging, and I was like, I'm going to bring and I'm just going to bring superintendents and admin. So I'm just going to focus on them. And so we rented a big place, and I got them to come down, and I'm so excited about having them. And halfway through the presentation, we broke for lunch, and guess what happened? Half of the people didn't come back. They, as superintendents and principals and special ed directors and curriculum directors, again, they weren't ready for the conversation. And so that was a big aha to me. And somewhat of an expensive lesson to learn, that again, we have to meet people where they're at, and they weren't ready for that. I will give a little bit of a success story though. Recently, we've had a district that is in the northern part of our region, and they've been engaging in some work with the Department of Education around literacy and a comprehensive literacy program. One of their strategies has been to look at the ICS program and integrate it, because they have a high English language learner population. And so they really want to think about how they're addressing equity within their school district as they're considering literacy as a comprehensive approach. And so that actually has been going very well, but they got buy-in early. They did presentations with the board, the school board. Everybody understood before anything was ever rolled out for PD what this is about, and that this is a system and that it's going to take time. So the stage was set, but it was set very intentionally and not just on a whim, come listen to the speaker. So again, live and learn, and that's what we do.
Absolutely. Yes.
Keep moving forward.
Keep it going.
So we had another small, I'd say, dabble in looking at equity, and this came from two of our northern districts that were somewhat rural and had a high population of children in poverty. And so they were looking at some strategies about how do we help our staff be more welcoming and understanding of students that are coming from different backgrounds, especially for the staff that maybe the majority had been from a middle class family, and now they're teaching a lot of students that are in poverty. And so these two districts pulled their resources together and brought in the researchers, Parrott and Budge, who wrote the book about turning high poverty schools into high performing schools. They had book studies. They brought those researchers together with both school districts to talk about strategies. How do we implement change? And then they tried some of those strategies, especially with regards to working with community organizations and families to ensure basic needs were met, or that students were coming to school having everything they need to get started. And I will say that coming at it from that way addressed that population. I will, however, say that that was one part, right? It's a little, we're finding that it's a little bit easier for our districts to talk about things like poverty than to go to the broader sense of equity. But this to me was a success story that we still see sustained even today, which is about 4 years later. So that was a good success. I have to put some positives.
Yeah, definitely. There were good things. There were good learning moments.
And if you want to learn more about the work around this particular high poverty, high achieving schools, there's a great article that talks, it's called 5 Questions That Promote Student Success. And when we think about their approach to helping schools support students and families, they touch on student learning, looking at how students are learning, what's our instructional framework look like, do we provide targeted interventions for students who need them? Looking at reading, are students proficient in reading? Because we know that is a big thing and a gateway of getting out of poverty if we can teach our students how to read. And then they also look at their professional learning system. What are we using in terms of research-based models for professional learning? How are we encouraging through our staff reflective practice? And then we can't forget looking at it at the systems perspective, being, are we as a district participating in that data-based inquiry when we're thinking about how we're serving all students? And so that's that approach of focusing on student, professional, and system learning. Again, another great model, accessible But again, to get real change, have to think about it from a systems perspective. So thinking about those two things, we don't give up down here, you know, we're going to continue going, right?
Yeah.
So we decided we're going to pilot something. We're going to take some things that we think will make a difference in our region, take a little bit of this, take a little bit of that, and pilot a program. So we piloted a program called All In, which we borrowed that name from another region who was doing some similar work. And it focused on elements of equity in education.
Mm-hmm.
So we worked with some other SSTs to understand their model, get some resources, and get a firm foundation for our own consultants so we knew how to move forward with our pilot. And then we picked 2 pilots to participate in some professional learning, to get some coaching and some technical assistance. And this is specifically for examining equity and social justice within their districts. We also provided an opportunity for students from those 2 districts to come together to identify some challenges and work on creating social justice projects so that they can have a part in this as well. And I think I'll let Georgia pick up because she was the head of this wonderful little project, right?
Little project. Yes. Little. I think the biggest thing that we learned from this is that we had to prepare ourselves. So our team really had to spend a lot of time examining our own implicit biases. We spent a lot of time in conversations that weren't easy to have. We all bring, again, our own beliefs in our own belief systems to the table. And there were times that we had to become comfortable being uncomfortable and comfortable in calling each other out. So we actually spent a whole year preparing for this. And it was a whole year of having conversations and looking. And one thing that we found really interesting is that you find a lot of information about equity for urban schools, but not a whole lot of information about equity in rural districts. So it was a very humbling experience, and it gave us the opportunity to learn about ourselves as we went through this. We did have 2 districts participate in this pilot program. And we had a rural district and we also had an urban district. And it was interesting to have them both at the table because both districts approach this from being more equitable for their students with disabilities. That was the idea behind this. And they were allowed to pick which lens they wanted to go through, but that's what they chose. And it turned into digging in deeper and realizing a couple of things. The first thing is they really didn't know who their populations were. When questions were asked about, well, how many students do you have who have disabilities? What are your percentages in different classrooms? What is the representation of your students with disabilities in honors classes or in advanced placement classes? How many of them are taking utilizing the College Credit Plus or taking college level classes? Do you have any students with disabilities doing that? And that was just the lens that we really approached it from. It was very clear that both districts struggled with that. So we wanted to have a book study with this. So as they were investigating their data, because that's what year 1 was investigating their data, right? We're pulling it together and we're learning together. We did use Gary Howard's book, We Can't Teach What We Don't Know. And he does come from a perspective of being a white male. And his eyes were open when he had biracial grandchildren. And those of you who have grandchildren know they are the apples of our eye, right? And when you see them being treated differently, it hurts. It hurts even more than when you see your own kids because, well, they get to go home. So there, it's even greater. But um, one of the things that we realized is one district or urban district really took to this book and had conversations, even though this dealt a lot with race. They were willing to generalize the information, to think about if we're talking about and plugging in our students with disabilities in the same concepts that Gary Howard shared in this book. Wow, we can impact change this way. Our rural district stopped the book study after the second chapter and said, we don't have a diverse population. We haven't done the book study. So just one of the differences. And again, knowing where we're at and what we're ready for, right? I think a lot of times educators want strategies, but looking at ourselves is really difficult. And when we're doing equity work, it's about you. It isn't about the students. It's about what we think. What are our beliefs? What are we bringing to the table? Where do we have those gaps or those implicit biases that are really impacting the way that we're treating our students when they walk through the door? So it was very eye-opening when we had this. I will say the other piece of this was the student engagement. So usually you don't bring students in until year 2. We decided to try and bring them in year 1. And it was so interesting, number one, seeing the students from both districts interact. The other thing that was really interesting was the fact that they were so much more willing to be flexible about things than their teachers were. And we were warned of that ahead of time. But the whole purpose of our All-In project was for them to create their own plan of how they're going to disseminate this information and get their faculty talking about equity. How can we make these conversations happen? How do we guide it? How do we allow our students to help guide it? How do we prepare our teachers for students calling you out if you're not really being equitable? What does that look like? And I will say both districts struggled with that a little bit, but and not that it's not a judgment when we think about a rural district versus an urban district, but I think it speaks a lot to the culture. I think it speaks to the fact that a lot of times our rural districts, we just want to stay over here. We're used to our population. We're used to our people and the way that we've always done things. And it doesn't mean that they're always right. And change is hard. And change is hard. But we know this is something that we need to continue to work at. And I think the bigger thing was learning for ourselves that we feel shame when we go through this stuff. When we participate in equity studies, regardless of whether we're talking about race or we're talking about students with disabilities, when we're talking about anything equity, it can be a very shame-filled time for us. And supporting each other through it was huge. It was so important that we really needed to be there for each other and have a lot of conversations. Unfortunately, the pandemic hit, and so we didn't get to complete year 2 of the project, but it certainly, if nothing else, it opened our eyes to the need of sharing our experiences and sharing them shamelessly, and just saying, like, I struggle with this. Yeah. I've worked with students with disabilities my whole career. I worked with a lot of students who have behaviors or who have significant adverse childhood experiences that have shaped who they are. I'm comfortable there. That's my comfort level. If you put me with students who everything comes easy to them, I know I have biases. I know I struggle. I'm much more comfortable with the people who aren't included. So that great experience. I would encourage anybody to start having those conversations, but just realize you're going to have to be supportive, and you're going to have to take the time with your staff to share with them, like, I know this feels crummy. I know. And I think the other thing was getting them to share. Our urban district, my goodness, we couldn't get them to stop talking.
Right.
Yeah. But our rural district had their superintendent there, and none of them said a word through the whole training. And we spent 3 days together. So
it was such an experience. I mean,
right. And it taught us
really learning.
Yeah. And not, again, this isn't to shame either of the districts. It was just a learning experience for us.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I think that again, just added to our journey of where do we go next? And so it was interesting. Actually, this summer, we were managing through COVID, kind of everything just feels like, we can't get together. We have so much going on. But as we started to approach the summer, I did have actually a joint vocational school reach out to me. They had noticed some issues with equity, thinking about students who were identifying as what they thought was a different gender, and the staff would come to the principal and say, well, I don't know what I'm going to do about this. What do I even do about this? And so, they were starting to realize that they could have some issues on their hands if they didn't start to address staff's reaction to some of the things that we had been drawing their attention to in the past. So we got together and we said, I had a pretty candid conversation with them. I'm like, you say the word equity, especially around here, and people are running. And he's like, yeah, they'll run. I said, so how are we going to frame it? And so we started talking about, how do staff want to interact with students? What do they want in terms of a relationship with their students? Do they want a friendly relationship, or do they want a contentious relationship, right? And nobody wants that. And we also know that a lot of these students that are coming in this area are coming from families that are in poverty, that there's some trauma going on. And so if we approached it through that lens of trauma, supporting healthy relationships, we might be able to get to that same experience, but we're going through a different avenue. And so that really got me to start thinking about, as we move into planning for another pilot project, what we might want to do again differently based on what we've learned. Now, I was all excited for this. Very excited. I had my program plan written out. I even had some money budgeted just to support trainings. And that got squashed by somebody above the principal, possibly. I was told they went in a different direction, and that's what I got. So, but that really started the wheels turning for me. And so in some of my work, I also work with the Department of Education to help them train other SSTs throughout the state of Ohio. And coincidentally, our focus this year has been on equity, and how are we as consultants across the state coaching and providing technical assistance around some topics to our districts and schools that need that type of support. And what we started to think about is, we, as I've said a few times during this presentation, and I know Georgia has said it too, we have to start thinking and meeting people where they're at. So coming in with our horses ready to go, ready to just change the world may not work for everyone. Where are our districts at? So we thought about this in two ways. For those districts that equity is not a contentious subject, the community talks about it, it's a very diverse community, we're including, you might be able to start with equity. And then you could reach out to other areas. So now that we've talked about equity being a focus, how do we see equity happening in our literacy? Does everybody have the opportunity to have access to high quality tier 1 core instruction? Special education. What do our ratios look like within our classrooms? What does that model look like? So in those places, we can start with equity and we can go deeper. But there are still places all over Ohio, especially in my region, where we can't start with equity. And so now we have to think about how do we start on the, what I call the outskirts. So let's think about early childhood, for example. Who has access to preschool in your district? Where are they going? Who doesn't have access? Is that fair? How do we change that? How do we know? Do we even have data to know? What are we providing in terms of supports around our behavior management system? So positive behavior intervention support. So what does that look like for all students? Is that fair and right for all students? So we're not saying that word equity, but we're looking at those different avenues and meeting people where they are. And so that brings us to what I would say, even though Georgia has left the SST and is moving on into her new role, we have some plans at that SST, and I know Georgia will support us anyway. And that's thinking more about 3 areas. One, we're engaging in professional development as a staff so that we are fully equipped to support our districts and schools at meeting them where they are in their equity journey. So that's our first one. A second thing that we're doing is we're doing regional meetings. And these regional meetings are engaging with just a few other SSTs across the state. And we're spending a specific amount of time on coaching. How do we practice coaching equity conversations? How do we look at data with the district to help them to see where there might be implicit biases and they don't even realize it, but it's showing up in their data. So we're looking at that in our regional setting. And then as soon as we get some things settled and we can say that this COVID has at least calmed down slightly, we're going to pilot again. But the idea will be piloting through those different lenses. So it may be looking at trauma informed. How do we talk about where do we want to see our students at and what kind of relationship do we want to have with them? So that's our plans for moving forward. So it wasn't all lost in terms of this journey, and it's been eye-opening. And we wanted to spend the last part, I know we have probably about 10 or 15 minutes left, but we wanted to spend the last part of our time together just talking about a few other strategies and resources that we've either come across or that we're excited to dig in more as we continue our journey of learning. So the first one that I wanted to share is this particular book, Districts That Succeed, Breaking the Correlation Between Race, Poverty, and Achievement by Karen Chenoweth. And this book has been used, it's a very popular text with some admin teams at the Ohio Department of Education this year. Some other SSTs are doing some book studies around this, but there are specific case studies and key takeaways from the book so that you can see that clear connection between what are actionable steps that work for districts in different settings where they've taken out race, poverty, and said, our kids are going to achieve. and we're going to make sure that they are. And so those are things that you might even think about as you're working with districts and whatever your capacity is. Could you do a book study? Could you do a peer-to-peer network to support strategies, sharing strategies around some of these issues? But it's important work, and book studies sometimes can bring people together to do that kind of thing. Another resource that we've interacted with, both of us have, has been Paul Gordsky and equity literacy. So, you know, a lot of our districts are comfortable, I'd say, going at the equity conversation through that lens of poverty. Oh yeah, we have poverty. Now we don't know exactly what we're going to do about that, but we have poverty, so we do have that, but we don't have many students that are different, have different ethnic backgrounds. That's not what we have, although they very much do have that. They just don't want to talk about it. So this is a great resource, and Paul Gordsky is a great resource about thinking about strategies to work with students in poverty. He also has a great website that's called Educational Equity for Literacy. And on that website, you can explore it more, but I just pulled a few things that he talks about when we think about somebody that might be literate in equity. So I'm going to go through those real quick with you. So that 5 abilities of equity literacy is the ability to recognize even the subtlest biases and inequities, the ability to respond skillfully and equitably to biases, the ability to redress biases and inequities by understanding and addressing them at their institutional, or I would say systems, roots. The ability to actively cultivate equity by applying a commitment to every decision around equity. And then finally, the ability to sustain equity efforts, even in the face of discomfort or resistance. And I think that is something that I want to strive towards. I think it's a really good thing to think about. So I'm going to pass this over to Georgia, because there's another resource that we both engaged in as well.
Yes, our fostering resilient learners, and how important this is. This book really does offer strategies for creating that trauma sensitive classroom. And we had a couple of districts engage in a book study in this, and also a couple of ESCs learn from this. I will say, if you're looking for something that provides strategies, this is your spot. But I also want to be careful. This isn't a way to fix kids. This is a way that we change how we approach students or how we engage with them in creating those relationships. We know that that is the number one factor of building resilience, is that, you know, that positive relationship that a student has, and how impactful that can be in mitigating the trauma stress that our students sometimes chronically live in. So this book in particular is more about strategies, but again, it's about our behavior. It isn't about the students. It's about how we approach and how we think about things. So fantastic resource.
Yeah, loved engaging with that book. So as we're coming to a close, we wanted to talk just that I hope you can see that we're both always learning more. One of the things that I feel like I've gained in these past 5 years in this particular position is the ability to not look so critically at everything that decisions I make or strategies that I try, but to become very curious about why something isn't working, or curious about why someone responded a certain way to something that I didn't think they were going to respond to in that certain way. when we think about consulting and supporting districts, our work is to build relationships. And so we have to have that trust, and we have to have trust within our own staff to be able to have those really difficult, brave conversations that we sometimes have to have when we're talking about a subject like equity. But having that curious mindset can help us continue to move forward and look for new resources, new strategies, a new way to engage so that we can serve our districts and ultimately so that they can serve all of our students to become very successful. And I think that that's been a critical key learning.
And I just want to add, be patient with your staff. This is not a sprint. This is definitely a marathon. They will come around. Take your time, be supportive, and as much as you can, try to mitigate the shame that they may be feeling or that you're feeling. But keep trying. Don't give up the conversation. Make sure that you have a safe space to have that conversation in and that your staff feels safe, because if they don't, they're not going to talk and it's just going to go by the wayside. So a critical piece is thinking about how do we build those relationships where we can have those conversations.
Yeah, that's great. Yes. So our last slide is our contact information. And so if you have additional questions for either one of us, our emails are there for you. And we have really enjoyed just working together to have this conversation.
Yes, it's been great.
It has been great. And we hope that you reach out if you have questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone. Take care.